Good evening and welcome to the first event of this semester's Humanities Lecture Series. I'm Victor Bailey, Director of the Hull Centre, which organises the event. It's our great pleasure this evening to bring you Iain McCalman, historian, explorer and broadcaster, who has spent many years researching the Great Barrier Reef and the human stories that the reef and its islands have generated over the centuries. Professor McCalman has flown all the way from Australia to be with us this evening, enlarging his carbon footprint for a worthy cause. Our speaker will take questions after his talk, if you would make your way to one of the two microphones. Afterwards, in the apps space behind me, there will be a reception where Professor McCalman will sign copies of his new book. Do please stay around for that. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the Hall Centre, as the programme you have indicates, Iain will be on hand for a conversation about this evening's talk and also about a new project he's doing on Teddy Roosevelt and his time in Africa. A session moderated by Andrew Denning, Assistant Professor of History. These morning events are very interactive and enjoyable occasions, and I encourage you to attend. To introduce Iain McCalman, I've asked Greg Cushman, Associate Professor of History and Environmental Studies. Greg came to KU in 2003 with a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Texas in Austin. He teaches courses on modern Latin America, the invention of the tropics, and the global environment. In 2007, he held a Fulbright Foreign Scholarship to Hungary. He's also been a long-serving director of the Nature and Culture Seminar, which is one of the Hall Centre's research seminars. Guano and the Opening of the Pacific World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, brought him justified renown. It's one of the first studies to examine the environmental and cultural history of the modern world from the perspective of the entire Pacific Basin. The book has garnered some prestigious awards, the finest of them perhaps being the Jerry Bentley Prize in World History from the American Historical Association. It is not every book that opens with the claim, the Black Death, the African slave trade, the Second World War, and the harvesting of bird excrement deposits from islands in the Pacific Oceans were of equal importance in world history. Yet it is guano, or bird droppings, built up on islands off the coast of Peru, the first imported source of nitrogen, which played such a crucial role in the development of global agriculture and capitalism. Last year, Greg received a very prestigious Andrew Carnegie Fellowship for a new work, A People's History of the Earth Under Human Domination. I can think of no one more qualified to introduce tonight's speaker and topic, so please welcome my very good colleague, Professor Greg Cushman.
Tonight is my great pleasure to welcome historian Iain McCalman from a distant shore to share some of his passion for Australia's Great Barrier Reef. But just how distant and how great is this place? If you decide after we're over to stroll about a dozen or so city blocks down to the train station after the talk and hop on the midnight train, it will take you the whole next day and most of the following morning before you finally reach Los Angeles, where you can bask among its eucalyptus and casuarina groves imported from down under, and finally arrive at the Pacific shore. That distance is almost the exact amount that you would need to travel, over 1,500 miles, in order to traverse Australia's Great Barrier Reef from end to end. Our closest route to the Pacific is the whole distance of the Great Barrier Reef. To reach Australia itself, home to the reef, eucalyptus, and our well-traveled guest, would require a journey of yet another magnitude. The Pacific Ocean, something that we don't tend to think about so much, at least on this shore, is so vast that all of the Earth's continents could easily fit within its watery boundaries, within its borders. Now, if we could somehow pick up and airdrop the massive labyrinth of coral, cays, and channels that make up the Great Barrier Reef over our hopelessly landlocked state, it would easily cover not only all of Kansas, several hundred meters, but half of Missouri as well. We are talking about the vast of the vast. Such enormity is almost incomprehensible and has long intimidated the best of the world's historians. Whole libraries have been devoted to studying the history of the Atlantic world, or even our state of Kansas for that matter. But why not the Pacific world? But let not your heart be troubled. Like a strong El Nino event blowing from the distant west, El Nino, of course, being generated by the massiveness of the Pacific, this is beginning to change right now in terms of earthly imbalance. There's a new generation of historians that are beginning to write histories of the whole Pacific world and of the Pacific Ocean itself. And they have done so by starting from, I guess, maybe a perspective we weren't ready to before, but certainly which Iain's book does, by recognizing that humanity's long relationship with the ocean environment itself, with the Pacific Ocean itself, is the main story of interest about this vast realm. McCalman's, and he emphatically subtitles this, passionate history of the Great Barrier Reef, from Captain Cook to climate change, stands quite high up on the shore above this tide of growing scholarship. And one of the reasons being, it's emphatically the story of people. A mix of, you numbered in 20, but it's more than, it's a couple dozen detailed biographies of people who, some were there for just a brief time, some have spent their whole lives in this environment, people who were passionate and left a remnant of their passion that the historian could use for his or her craft. Passionate about what is eminently convincing in this book is one of the Pacific Ocean's most spectacular and also most endangered places. Both as a general reader and as someone like me who's fascinated by the specific trend professionally, I cannot recommend this book more highly, both for its writing and the vigor that it brings to the story, as well as for its insights about the place and how it fits in the rest of existence. Iain's own passion for the Great Barrier Reef required much time and distance to develop. He was born and educated in what was then Nyasaland in southern Rhodesia, now known as Malawi and Zimbabwe, and experienced during his part of his life the last days of, or the last years of colonial rule in this region, and then moved on to complete his education in another corner of Britain's one-time empire at Australian National Universities and then at Monash University, where he got his PhD. Currently, he's research professor at the University of Sydney, although that only begins to describe his place in academic life and in the humanities in Australia, where he's quite an important figure. He's published a number of celebrated books and articles on Charles Darwin and his followers, on the Romantic movement, and on an 18th century magician alchemist, and brings much of that alchemy together in this book itself. As the preface to The Reef recounts, he first became interested in the Great Barrier Reef as part of a project in which he literally, along with dozens or maybe hundreds of others, sought to follow in the footsteps of Captain James Cook through the challenging seascape of the Great Barrier Reef, as they did back in the 18th century as among the first European-derived people to experience this environment. And at dinner right before, he gave us a rather harrowing perspective of what must have been one of the worst BBC film projects to work for you could possibly imagine, in which, as is sometimes, I hope I'm not stealing one of your jokes here, the astronomers and the botanists and the scientists were made officers in this voyage, but the the historians and other members of the humanities were made regular crew and had to climb over 100 feet into the air to help the sails bill in and out and work for their supper. In fact, he even led a small mutiny at one point. This is one thing, I love these kind of stories, and he starts his book actually by recounting part of this, because one thing that brings especially humanities scholars to become interested in something is often an experience or a group experience doing something. In this case, bodily experiencing what it was like to be a sailor in his crew, almost with too much historical accuracy. And that impacted you, and luckily did not ruin everything for you. You were able to fall in love with the reef. Maybe the reef was a respite from the horrors of the British Navy. This book, I'm just beginning to touch on all that it has, and of course he's going to talk to you about this in greater detail. This book reveals so much about the lives of explorers and scientists who came to this place, about the tribulations of a handful of people who have gone aboriginal and become integrated, some against their will, some voluntarily, with the native peoples of this region. And in a quite fascinating way, describes the oceanic roots of environmental consciousness in Australia. I don't want to steal too much from his thunder. Simply want to end by saying how excited I am to hear more about what you have to teach us about Australia's Pacific face, facing actually in the direction of us. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Greg. That was a wonderful introduction, and it brings a blush to my cheek. And thank you, Lawrence, for coming to hear me. I'm flattered. I know you have better things to do, so I hope it's worthwhile. Excuse me, I do have a bit of a chest, so I might struggle a bit. So I'll drink water. Right. Well, Greg, I'm going to begin with the story that Greg introduced slightly. A dozen years ago, I sailed through the Great Barrier Reef on the Endeavour replica in the wake of Captain Cook. I was featuring in a BBC and American Discovery TV series under simulated 18th century conditions, and it proved to be a truly horrible experience. I found myself trapped in a brutal reality show that should have been called Big Brother at Sea. We had to clamber up swaying masts without safety harness. We chipped our teeth on rock-hard ship's biscuits that even the reef sharks spat out. We retched on salt pork, and at night we crammed into tiny hammocks with a stranger's bottom just about there. And there was much else. For Cook and his sailors, the experience had been worse, but in opposite ways. They didn't worry about the food, the lack of sleep, the sail setting, but few, if any of them, could swim. They had no charts to go through this extraordinary labyrinth. They were suffering from scurvy on the boat, and they had no idea for a great deal of the voyage that there were coral reefs lurking beneath their ship. In fact, Cook sailed within the Barrier Reef for 800 kilometres without realising that he was doing that. And in fact, he never knew that to the end of his days. He just thought he was sailing in the sea, because there's a distance at the beginning of the reef of 200 kilometres between the shore and the outer reefs, but it then snakes in like this. So he discovered it on a night of June 1770 by bumping into it. Cook then realised, and they were marooned for a while, and I write about that in the book, in what he called an insane labyrinth of coral. And he realised that he also called it a monstrous ledge of rock, For him, it was his idea of hell, the worst place he had ever encountered. He would have ridiculed the idea that it might one day be seen as a fragile treasure whose existence stands threatened by human actions, this massive, monstrous thing. And I only realised it myself on that voyage at Lizard Island when a young biologist showed me swathes of coral that had been bleached by the warm reef waters. So at only a few degrees hotter than its average temperature, barrier reef corals bleach. What happens is that there's a tiny little plant in the cells of the coral, acting like a tree in effect. You might think of it as a sort of panel, an energy panel, where the light photosynthesizes and creates oxygen and gives energy, enough energy for that little tiny little creature to build these enormous rocks of limestone that resist the seas. Well, when it gets hot, the little symbiotic algae swim away. They leave, and all that's left is this white, stark skeleton, a kind of bone that is completely dead until it's reoccupied. So during my farewell swim there, I remember looking at this wonderful parrotfish, the most glorious fish, swimming in this violet-coloured coral, and thinking that this is possibly doomed. I suddenly realised what we stand to lose if this precious organism dies. In this new age, when humans have for the first time become physical forces of nature, we're destroying what David Attenborough calls the greatest natural wonder on our planet. Dredging up tons of silt chokes reef corals to death and also afflicts them with deadly disease. Yet we in Australia continue to dig passages for massive coal ships so that we can make the problem worse. Coral-eating starfish have become a reef plague because their larvae thrive in waters that are polluted with sewage. More frightening of all, we know that the planet's oceans are soaking up atmospheric carbon and creating, in effect, a kind of dilute form of carbonic acid, which then needs to dissolve limestone or an alkali in order to balance its pH. So what's happening is that reefs are gradually dissolving. They've been afflicted with osteoporosis. And so they will become more brittle, they won't grow as fast, so that the reef is being attacked, if you like, from multiple directions. Incidentally, plankton are also, many plankton have skeletons that have limestone, in effect, calcium skeletons. And krill feed on plankton. Krill are the baseline for so many other fish. So it's not just reefs that we're talking about here. We're talking about endangerment of very large parts of our whole oceanic universe, if you like. So that's why I wrote the book, The Reef, A Passionate History, why I'm delighted to talk to you tonight. My book describes passionate encounters between reef peoples and reef places over more than 2 centuries, and it's unabashedly composed of stories, something that is quite unfashionable still, I think, within academia, but which I believe to be the most powerful way that humans can communicate with each other, and particularly to reach audiences outside any of our specialisms. So tonight I'd like to sketch 2 reef stories for you that I think still speak urgently to the present, even though they're stories from the past. The first is a story of a forgotten castaway who was taught to love the reef by its original human caretakers, and I'm going to show that as in the form of a film which I've made for a website. The website's designed especially for students and school kids, and there are 3 short films on it.
In 1858, a French merchant ship called the St. Paul left Hong Kong bound for Australia, carrying a human cargo of 317 Chinese labourers destined for the goldfields of New South Wales. The ship's captain, Emmanuel Pinard, decides to risk a dangerous shortcut between New Guinea and the Great Barrier Reef and gets caught in a storm. The ship hits a coral reef off Russell Island and sinks near the Louisiade archipelago, 200 kilometres southeast of New Guinea.
And what, on the face of it, might appear to be just another shipwreck story, turns out, in fact, to be one of the most extraordinary, important and forgotten events of Great Barrier Reef history. And its importance derives from one of the ship's survivors. He was a 14-year-old French cabin boy called Narcisse Pelletier.
Stranded on a tiny waterless strip of rock opposite Russell Island, Captain Pinard decides secretly to sail a longboat to Australia to get help, leaving behind the Chinese labourers and Pelletier. Guessing at his intention, Pelletier swims out and intercepts the boat.
Had he not done so, he would have died on that strip of rock with the rest of the Chinese labourers.
For the next 12 days, the longboat drifts in light winds and scorching heat. The crew survives by eating a few seabirds, drinking their own urine, and catching occasional mouthfuls of rainwater in their boots. They eventually make a landfall somewhere near Cape Direction, midway along the Cape York Peninsula, not far from present-day Lockhart River. This area is known by Aborigines as the Sand Beach, and it's absolutely dazzling. It's dense with mangroves and lush bush, it teems with kangaroos and an enormous variety of fish. This place is a paradise. But for the people in the boat, it is like nothing they've ever known.
Remember, these people have come from the Northern Hemisphere. Some of them have never seen a tropical island. What they're seeing here is an utterly bizarre and frightening place. They move a little way inland from the beach and they find a native well, a little like this. It may not look much, but if you're desperately thirsty and you dig the sand out, the water will seep up and you'll have a little pool of fresh water. Greedily, the adult sailors push Pelletier aside, they jump down there and they slurp up all the water until there's nothing left. They tell him, wait here till the water comes back, and they leave.
At some point, Narcisse falls asleep, exhausted. He returns later to the beach to find the longboat gone. This 14-year-old boy has been abandoned in one of the most remote places on Earth.
is only a kid. He knows little outside of France. His horizons are immensely small. And he's in a place like he's never seen before. It is utterly vast. One end of the other, you can barely see. It stretches away into the distance. He's desperately thirsty. Where is he going to find anything to drink? Where can he eat? There's no familiar fruit. Behind is this endless bush. Strange, discordant sounds that the birds make. And what is in it? Beasts, cannibals. The next morning, Peltier wakes to glimpse 3 naked women scurrying through the bush. Half an hour later, he is suddenly confronted by 2 fierce-looking warriors, naked and holding spears. Terrified, he holds out a little tin cup and a handkerchief as tokens of goodwill. The fierce warriors hold out their hands in a gesture of reassurance, and later they bring him fruit and water to drink. One of the warriors, the fiercest of them, is named Mardaman, and he has no children of his own. He decides he will adopt this child as his own, and he will call him Anko.
Narcisse is taken to a larger camp of around 30 to 50 individuals, the temporary headquarters of a small maritime clan of Wanthala people speaking the Utalnanu language. Here, Anko is introduced to the people who will become his kin and companions for the next 17 years. His life as an indigenous man is about to begin.
So, this is in the dry season or right through the year?
Right through the year.
Right through the year. What's the best time?
Descendants of the clan who saved Narcisse still live in the area. They call themselves Night Islanders, after Night Island, which lies about 2 hours south of here in the centre of their traditional country.
This boy, this French boy, he's 14 when he comes, he's 31 when
11 years, yeah.
See? He thinks he's a farmer. You know?
Yeah.
He does.
The scars on Narcisse Peltier's chest, and which can be seen in this later photograph, are testimony to his link with the Night Island clan.
He's got the same mark his cousin's granddad has. You know, the old fella in that book with the marks on his chest?
Yes, his marks on his chest and on his shoulder.
Yeah, on his shoulder. It's like spear marks on these.
Your grandfather had it?
Yeah. He got a tribal mark on
his chest like that?
Yeah,
just
like
that,
yeah.
same?
Yeah, the same.
And he's in the book, the Torman.
Yeah. It's really important, I think, for us to understand how deeply assimilated this man was in his clan. He turned out to be an expert maker of spears and a really fine builder of boats. He seems to have built his own outrigger boat. These are skills he probably learnt back in France. But it made him a significant figure, and particularly in the most important thing for young men of the Wanthala tribe, and that is dugong hunting. This is the absolute apex of status and achievement in the Wanthala clan, and he's very good at it. He's fearless. He goes out in his boat up to 40 kilometres, sometimes with his cousin, up to 40 kilometres out to sea, out to the outer barrier. And he spears dugong, brings them back, and divides them among the elders. He's also a warrior in the sense that he participates vigorously and enthusiastically in local clan fights. He claims to have been involved in 12 clan fights and to have killed at least 2 people himself. It's almost certain that he married and produced several children. There are various bits of evidence from later on from anthropologists like Tyndall that in this area there were these children with reddish hair. This kind of Celtic element had come through with the indigenous one. We can imagine this boy, he's 14 when he arrives here. He lives with the Wantala people for 17 years. He completely forgets his mother tongue, and Utalango becomes the native language of his thought and his speech. This boy was no longer a Frenchman, he was an Australian. But eventually, and tragically, at the age of 31, Narcisse's past catches up with him. In April 1875, a bêche de mer lugger anchors over there at Knight Island looking for water. They see among the crowd of Aborigines on the shore a wild-looking, copper-coloured man. He's got chest scarifications, he's naked, and he's carrying a spear. At once, they recognise him as a white man. Without consultation, they decide to rescue him at gunpoint. Without being able to understand a word of what they say, Peltier can do nothing for fear of being shot.
He is taken first to Somerset, a settlement in the Torres Straits, before being transferred to Sydney. Observers describe Narcisse behaving like a caged bird, crouching on his heels, casting quick, eager, suspicious glances around him, rarely speaking, and apparently unable to remember more than a few words of his mother tongue. He has acute difficulty remembering anything about his original family. Transferred from ship to ship, Narcisse is eventually returned to France.
Peltier's return to civilization proves traumatic. Though he's greeted with great rejoicing when he arrives at his village of Saint-Gilles, his family find his savage appearance and his pagan beliefs disquieting, if not repulsive. They show their unease by having him exorcised by a Catholic priest.
To add to his burden, Narcisse is condemned by a new racial science. It categorises Australian Aborigines as the lowest on the ladder of human species. Yet these are the very people who've shown the 14-year-old boy a lifetime of love and kindness. The same year, Narcisse's story is documented by a medical man, Constance Merland, who produces a memoir called 17 Years Amongst the Savages.
Peltier, he says, has been forced to live for 17 years with his soul in a state of suspended slumber, like a white savage.
Peltier will live for the rest of his life under these bleak racial assumptions.
Appointed to the lonely position of lighthouse keeper by the government, Peltier grew morose and solitary, either staring wistfully out to sea or flying into rages when taunted by local villagers with his nickname, Le Sauvage, the Savage. In 1883, he married a young seamstress. The couple had no children and very few friends.
Narcisse Peltier died of unknown causes on the 28th of September 1894 at the age of 50. Villagers speculated that he'd succumbed either to the long-term effects of Aboriginal sorcery or to a primitive nostalgia for his clan and country. Both explanations suggest that they viewed him as a failed Frenchman, unable to escape the legacies of savagery he'd inherited on the sand beaches of Australia.
The remote Lockhart River settlement on Cape York Peninsula is home to an Aboriginal community of about 800 people, drawn from 5 different language groups that were forced into a mission and forced together, and then the mission was closed down, so they were relocated away from their original country, as they're called. Nobody in Lockhart River has any memory of what life was like before the mission. When I went there, I found copies of The Reef, this book. It's actually the only book of any kind in Lockhart River. And it was well thumbed. And to my delight, I'd found there that it has generated a cultural renewal among these people. Everywhere, I was told how vital the story has become for their living community. They've started to do local industries using the sea law that they'd lost, building canoes again. They've had a window into a world that they had lost and never knew. And it's a window that reveals a rich and complex way of life for a life that Europeans had eradicated. And it has revived memories of their heartland and their kin. They're tracing their kin. They're reviving even their language as a result of this historical story. Well, 2 years ago, when I was making the Peltier film, I was also approached out of the blue from a group of local citizens, Europeans in this case, environmentalists and tourist businesses. Their town and environs had been savaged by successive cyclones 5 years apart. They'd ripped the roofs off the houses, they'd mangled the beaches, the waterfronts, fringing reefs, smashed down ancient forests, killed a third of the last remaining population of cassowaries in Australia. The still shattered community had decided to come together in a collaborative drive to rebuild Mission Beach as an environmental paradise, if you like. They wanted to build it round a popular story in my book, a story of a struggle to save the reef that occurred in what I call the Great War of 1965 to 75, to save the reef from uncontrolled development. The fight for the reef had been led and won from Mission Beach. So they want to restore the whole love of the reef via this story. They asked me to help make the story a rallying point for their traumatised community, a source of economic and cultural renewal for them, and a larger allegory, I suppose, for our climate-challenged times. So this is the story, the second of the stories that I'm going to tell. Like most wars, it began with a skirmish. Midway through 1967, a famous Australian poet, Judith Wright, was president of a small Queensland wildlife society, and she received a plea in the mail for help from a man from Mission Beach called John Buist, who is an obscure Bohemian painter, an artist. He discovered that a sugarcane farmer had applied to the Queensland government, and for Queensland, think Alabama, to mine Ellison Reef near Mission Beach for cheap limestone fertiliser for his cane. Sensing a vital test case, Buist lodged an objection. The objection was quite simple. He said the reef is not dead, it's alive. They claimed that the reef was dead, and they already started to gouge great chunks out of it. Anyway, he lacked any scientific qualifications, so his testimony was refused in court. He squeaked an adjournment and managed eventually to persuade a small group of PhD students from the Queensland University who are doing zoology to dive on Ellison Reef, which they did. And they made an underwater survey. So when the court resumed, they reported and recorded having seen 190 species of fish and 88 species of living coral on Ellison Reef. Though mining had already begun, and I've dived there, this huge dead swathe through the middle of the reef, the warden recommended against further destruction, and the Queensland Minister for Mines very reluctantly had to endorse this ruling 6 months later. This small local victory unleashed a war because it goaded the Conservative Queensland government into larger action. Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who became the Premier, could not have cared less that a few artists and students were outraged at the prospect of mining the reef for oil, gas, cement and fertiliser. He instructed his minister to zone 80% of the reef. So 80% of a reef that is very well described, but I use the analogy, it's half the size of Texas, which, you know, is a good American kind of measure. So, the opponent, Wright, a poet, friend called Len Webb, who was a forester, and Buse, this dropout artist, got together to lead a resistance struggle against this development. They seem unlikely figures to be able to halt a juggernaut coalition of government politicians, local developers and international mining interests. Born in 1915, Judith Wright had grown up in the dry, lean highlands of New England around her family's ranch, as you would call it. We call it a station. Yet she was alienated from her gentrified peers because she believed that they and her family had dispossessed the land's original peoples. She was a romantic in the deepest sense, blessed with a soaring imagination, and she worked through the power of language and myth and symbol to absorb and express the harsh beauty of the Australian continent and the caring ethos of its Aboriginal peoples, like Angkor. Well, Judith's husband, Jack McKinney, was a former sheep drover turned philosopher, and he helped shape the couple's dissidence. They lived in a timber cutter's cottage in the rainforests of Queensland, and they worked out a sweeping indictment of modern Western civilization, dominated, as they said, by greed, technologies of power, and indifference to humane moral values. Above all, they believed that Australia needed to undergo a revolution, a change of heart to embrace the Aborigines' traditional and ancient holistic ethic of what they call caring for country. Well, Judith formed a small wildlife preservation society to promote the preservation of all forms of flora and fauna and the education of children and adults in the principles of wildlife protection and conservation. The barrier reef's beauty and fragility had lodged deep in her imagination in 1949 when she'd stayed for several weeks at Lady Elliot Island, one of the islands that Greg has looked at that was being badly defaced by guano mining. Nevertheless, she fell in love with the reefs, and she fell in love with the idea of the reef, the coral reefs. They became a kind of these sublime architectural creations of a tiny little polyp, became her personal metaphor to describe heroic individuals who built structures of moral defiance against huge oceanic forces of destruction. She called these such people coral builders. Only those coral insects live that work and endure the breaker's cold continual thunder. They are the quick of the reef that rots and crumbles in calmer water. Only those men survive who dare to hold their love against the world, who dare to live and doubt what they are told. They are the quick of life. Their faith is insolence. Joyful is their grief. Well, soon after setting up the Wildlife Society, she met exactly such a builder, a guy called Dr. Len Webb, a scientist, a forester, a poetry lover, a vital and urgent man with a love for the magnificent forests he studied. The point is, the Great Barrier Reef is the reef, the ancient forests of Gondwanaland come right up to the beaches. So we've got the two greatest forms of world heritage meeting together around the Great Barrier Reef. Well, Lenz was a self-made man, the American model. His mother was a station cook. His father was a horsebreaker. He did his education as a scientist was done at night school. During the war, he was put into a munitions factory because he'd done chemistry. And the army then funded him to study biochemistry. And during that time, he received a life-changing offer from the Australian Government Research Organisation, which is called the CSIRO. Because of wartime shortages of medicines and drugs, they asked him to make a phytochemical survey of the rainforest to look for medicinally useful alkaloids that could be turned into drugs. So from 1944 to 1952, Len, on his own, combed the immense rainforest skirting the reef. Having thousands of plants to study, he learnt to supplement his formal science with a taste test for alkaloids that he learnt from Aboriginal people. Many of these Aborigines also shared his awe of what he called the mystery and sacred beauty of the rainforest. One day, he said, he experienced a kind of life-changing epiphany, a sort of conversion in the forest. I was overwhelmed without feeling claustrophobic or afraid by this complex terrestrial ecosystem. He told Judith and his friend John that it was like being infused with soul or heart or spirit. This, a tough, down-to-earth scientist. As Len struggled to understand the patterns of tree growth and association, his search for a suitable framework to understand it led him to take the first PhD in ecology in Australia. He and his assistant, two of them, were then given the job of mapping the patterns of diversity and community of all of Australia's rainforest along the entire east coast. That's thousands and thousands of kilometres, not just the thousands of kilometres that make up the Barrier Reef, but the whole of Australia, which is not much smaller than America. Well, with a little help from Len, John Buist also had a similar kind of conversion, this artist. The two men discovered a common love of scientific, romantic ideas, of Tennyson's poetry, of Wagner's music, and of the euphoric effects of ethyl alcohol, which they happened to have with them. Buist came from a wealthy mining family who'd sent him to university in preparation for a glossy legal career, like his best friend Harold Holt, who became Prime Minister just at this time of the federal government. But John had dropped out in the 1930s, he'd gone to a commune, became an expert craftsman in adobe, wood, glass and stone, and an artist. A family bequest enabled him in the 1940s to purchase land on an island just off Mission Beach called Badara Island within the Barrier Reef. Here, he and his wife Alison lived a very unbuttoned existence for 17 years, as it happens. They built an adobe house. They walked around naked most of the time, sold the odd painting, and had a kind of, idyllic, paradisiacal life, except that development occurred on the island. And by the 1950s, the intrusions of developers had made them flee across to the mainland, where the forests were still there, in order to escape civilization. And they hand-built the first ever and still remaining cyclone-proof bungalow in Australia on a recipe that they got from America. But on the evening they moved into this incredible bungalow, they learnt that the ancient rainforest behind the house had been co-opted by the army for exercises in defoliant bombing with Agent Orange. And in fact, large amounts of the rainforest had been categorised for this particular purpose. So Len and John Buist got together and they fought that, and that's one of the campaigns that were won. They defeated the army in law courts. Well, over the next decade, these three, the Wright, Buist and Webb, became welded, as Judith Wright said, in a very deep companionship. They were the three who led this campaign, Australia-wide campaign to stop the development of the reef. They had a few early spats. By inclination and upbringing, Buist was less democratic than his friends. "My Irish blood," he said, "and the urgency of the cause makes me impatient." He gained the fighting name in that area of the Bingle Bay Bastard. And he chafed at his friend's commitment to slow educative methods. He ranted in a letter that I've seen. He says to Len, "The puss-footing, polite, ivory-towered vapourings of your academic mates are a waste of time. Look, chum," he urged Len, "just forget about the education angle for a while, will you? It's bloody silly for the moment to educate future generations to preserve the rainforest. There won't be any." Len responded to John's challenge in the way he knew best, by writing popular science books, articles, by, in effect, a popular science campaign, taking ecology in forms that kids could understand, taking it out to schools, to students, articles, newspapers, and so on. Drawing on one of Judith's poems, too, he argued that wilderness answers a powerful emotional and aesthetic yearning in human beings. He says we need a new word to convey the feeling of deep enjoyment and wonder, that feeling of privilege in witnessing the life of animals and birds and in moving among wild scenery. Still, when he cautioned the students not to become sentimental, however, about nature, Judith, who had a very sharp tongue, I might say, said to him, "Don't be so bloody silly." She said, "Sentiment is a good word. Look it up in the dictionary." He looks it up. He said, "The definition, thought tinged with emotional feeling, bound up with some subject or ideal," marked the beginning of Len's understanding of the value of what he called emotional intelligence. Soon after, Judith published her own creed in an influential popular article, as well as her poetry, entitled "Conservation as a Concept." And it hailed the arrival of what she called a hopeful new science of ecology that works in the human as well as in biological fields. This fusion, she said, of conservationist ideals and ecological methods was generating a groping movement towards a new kind of understanding which shall take into account actual living processes and interdependencies, and which can see man as part of a wider process of nature and subordinate to nature's laws. It might even, she thought, provide a point at which a new spark can jump across the gap that separates the arts and the sciences and allow a new kind of cooperation and understanding to grow up. Well, in Joe Bjelke-Petersen's government, the trio faced the most effective right-wing populist movement in Australian history. Joe might have done well in the primaries, actually, come to think of it. He loved to denigrate conservationists as a lunatic fringe of nitwits, cranks and ratbags. And untroubled by any consistency, he called them flower-sniffing fools, commies, intent on overthrowing the Australian way of life, and, would you believe, agents of American capitalism. All at once. To prove his point, he appointed Professor Harry Ladd, an American geologist with extensive mining connections, to survey the potential impact of mining on the reef. Ladd achieved this task in less than a month, briskly flying over it, its 1,600 miles of coral, in the company of Bjelke-Petersen's officials. He reported in March 1968 that oil and gas discoveries looked promising all over the reef, and he recommended that some reefs should be used for fertiliser and cement manufacture. A furious Judith Wright compared this to demolishing the Taj Mahal for road gravel. The trio also had to contend with a litany of personal setbacks. Judith's partial childhood deafness came back completely during the campaign, so she became stone deaf. And John Buse developed throat cancer. Her poem, Australia 1970, echoes her despair under the cumulative weight of so many difficulties and so much opposition. For we are conquerors and self-poisoners, more than the scorpion or snake, and dying of the venoms that we make, even while you die of us. If the barrier reef could think, it would fear us, she fretted. We have its fate in our hands. Oil and gas mining, she said, would give the death blow to a reef that was already sick from fertilisers, pesticides, dredging silt, sugar plant effluent and urban sewage. She told Australians that the plight of the reef was a microcosm of the fate of the planet. The battle to save it, a microcosm of the new battle within ourselves to be environmentalists. Well, all of this fierce advocacy preserved Australians for a watershed moment in January 1969, which some of you might remember, when an oil rig off Santa Cruz started spewing crude oil into California's indigo waters. This was shown on television in Australia in news almost every night. Infernos of rotting fish, oil-clogged seabirds, viscous black beaches. And Australians were deeply shocked. It suddenly occurred to him that this is what could happen to our reef. The Queensland mining minister didn't help matters by arguing publicly that oil, being protein, would actually nourish the fish and other marine organisms. Polls began to show that a majority of Queenslanders now opposed the reef, and a bipartisan group of politicians, citizens, unionists and so on started to roll. This momentum just grew from that moment. So in a sense, America delivered us the gift that saved the reef, really, which was your own terrible plight at Santa Cruz. At this point, the war to protect the reef was effectively won. The election of the Labor government in 1972, Royal Commission report, High Court's decision in favour of federal sovereignty over the reef, these all paved the way for a political settlement. And both sides of Parliament agreed to work together, which they never do now. And they eventually passed in June 1975 the Marine Park Act. 6 years later, in October 1981, the Great Barrier Reef gained World Heritage listing as the most impressive marine area in the world. Well, the three, though proud of helping to win the reef war, they knew that their victory remained provisional. Judith Wright, who wrote a book called Coral Battlefield, called the final chapter of her book, Finale Without an Ending. Popular memory, she said, was short, and onslaughts on the reef's oil and mineral resources could resume any time, and so they have. Well, our Mission Beach collaboration of academics, scientists, artists, community people that we gathered together to try to tell this story for Mission Beach also persuaded governments to act. We persuaded ecologists with expert UNESCO experience to help us prepare a formal case to link the wet tropics World Heritage Rainforest Area and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park through Mission Beach. So Mission Beach became the kind of connecting point between these two World Heritage areas. The juncture of this will be Buste's magnificent bungalow. It's 8 bedrooms and bathrooms hand-built, and its surrounding lands. It overlooks incredible, beautiful series of islands, and behind it is the rainforest they saved from Agent Orange. That has been given, thanks to our agitation, it's been given to the people of Mission Beach as an environmental research centre and a community environmental centre for the very, very rich community actions that now become staples of that town. I'd like to think that this application, which has gone through so far, as a small posthumous victory for an inspirational collaboration between a poet, an artist and a scientist, that symbolised what a few individuals from the natural sciences, the humanities and the arts can do when they work together towards a common goal. Thank you very much. So very happy to take questions.
Maybe I can start off, Ian.
Okay,
I'm
sure.
sure they'll warm up eventually.
Warm up. Yeah, I know. I can see that.
I don't know whether there's actually a decent question here, but I was struck by one line in, I think it was Judith Wright's manifesto at one point, when she said that humans should be subordinate to nature's laws. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Now, I think on the whole we all realize that we've actually acted in very reverse ways. We really, I think, have tried to overwhelm or controvert nature's laws in everything we've done practically. But the thought occurred to me, in this area of the reef and so on, what are nature's laws and how would they guide us to know what to do with the reef or how to preserve the reef? What are nature's laws in this respect?
Yeah, the thing that is most threatening the total destruction of the reef, because the reef can grow back, you know, if you look after it. Even bleaching can be redeemed. But what it can't deal with now is the change in the that has been created by greenhouse gases. I mean, we've made the water, nature didn't make the water warm without our help. We've increased the water temperature by about 1 degree, which means, and this year there's massive, you know, it's an El Nino year. Although one of my friends, a coral scientist, says we get El Nino now on the reef every year, in a sense. But there is a massive and instant areas of bleaching, which is human-created. And of course, nothing that's been suggested to help the reef actually addresses that central problem. The acidification of the water, the change in the weather, the intensification of the cyclones, and the fact that the water is warmer. All the other problems could be solved. They are within human capacity to solve. Presumably that one is, but we know that it's striking massive opposition. In Australia, as in the United States, a very large percentage of people don't believe in global warming. They don't believe that atmospheric carbon has anything to do with anything. Even though, as my friend who works on, he won the Darwin Medal, and he is a scientist who's responsible for finding 20% and naming 20% of the world's corals. He spent 17,000 hours underwater in the Barrier Reef. He points out that, going through the fossil record, all but one of the last mass extinctions seems to have been a result of a carbon problem where the water has acidified. Not, of course, created by humans, but by huge volcanoes and other kinds of natural events. So we have to do something about that. And of course, no one is at all interested in doing it. On the contrary, we are opening up just next to the reef the biggest coal mine in the world, the Galilee Basin. It's so big that if all the coal in it was burnt, or a large percentage of the coal in it was burnt, it would become the 7th biggest creator of CO2 in the world. This one mine. In order to manage that development, we have to dredge, because the coral is very shallow. Now there's huge ships to take this. The shipping is increasing by an order of 10 in magnitude. These massive ships are going to go down this windy little shallow area, which is dredged up. The dredging spews sand, takes it for kilometres through winds and currents, but it also churns up the biological composition, and you get bacteria that produce coral disease, and that's been very well demonstrated by scientists on the reef. So here we are, having seen the reef saved once. The prediction of Judith Wright and co. that it would come under attack again is duly proved. So, nature's laws do exist in a sense, and you're quite right. We've supplanted nature as we're acting as a physical force. We are the physical forces that we now have to try and stop. Yes.
What I'm about to say is, I think, simplistic. I believe that children, and Rachel Carson was a great believer of the fact that children experience wonder in nature.
Yes.
That's a simplistic opening line. I think that continues to be true, but I feel that children who are the future are not, for many reasons, a diversity of reasons, which we don't need to talk about, are not these days having experiences in the natural world. My question for you is Australia doing a better job than I think the United States is doing in introducing information about the reef, about other aspects of Australia's remarkable environment into early childhood education?
That's a good question. They're certainly trying to do that, but I don't know how effectively, really.
I think they must be doing this.
Yeah, they are trying to do it, and we're also trying to do things like, I'm working with a filmmaker, a scriptwriter who did Happy Feet, and we're trying to do a kind of equivalent of Happy Feet of an environmental kind. I mean, you know, Happy Feet does have an environmental message, but to try and find a reef version of that, and so there's somebody trying to raise money to do that, with a very definite aim of reaching children. And children are, as long as the reef doesn't die before they grow up, you know, they are our best hope. It's certainly our best hope in Australia more generally. What is happening, the only thing that seems to be persuading people are crises, massive bushfires. The bushfires are worse and worse. You know, the rising sea levels are now wiping out islands that in the Torres Strait. Those people are going to be refugees. We've got this whole refugee thing going. So crises seem to be the only way to persuade people to take the issue seriously. Yes?
Just a side comment. I think just in general, being a child, like understanding the extent of, you know, this self-caused environmental damage is imperative, and I don't think that children need it to be dumbed down for them, you know, with entertainment. I remember being a kid and having the privilege of, you know, growing up in a liberal area of California, being very concerned about the environment and environmental issues. But the problem was that it wasn't integrated enough or, you know, funded enough to be institutionalized in school.
Yeah.
And that's the real, I mean, I think that she pinpoints a really important issue that, you know, that's really, I think, where that sort of change needs to take place, because how are you going to build a career force that is environmentally aware and aware of, like, sustainable action that needs to take place if, you know, it's not being taught early on?
That's right. I do also believe, not only for children but also for adults, that art is very important. So environmental artists, because they, I mean, trying to describe acidification, it is what a very fine environmental writer, Australian Rob Nixon, calls slow violence. It's not spectacular, it's stealthy, you can't see it, it's invisible. And so it doesn't have any dramatic power. It's a kind of complex story about, you know, the photosynthesis and so on. And acidification is very difficult to understand. And almost nobody knows about it in Australia. So in all the interviews I had, I don't know, I had more than 100 interviews after the book. Nobody ever asked me about acidification, and very few asked me about, actually about the heat problem, the water warming. They just those issues have not got through to adults, let alone kids. So one of the things there is that we have a great group of artists who work with us in my centre, and they have this power to render something, you know, something that grabs you and in a way that vaults over too much of the kind of verbal complexities of it. So I really think that the environmental art is in the forefront. It's one of the most hopeful things. And there is an enormous amount of it going on. And then, of course, it does go into movies and other kinds of things.
Let's go to the mic over there, please.
Oh, thank you very much for the talk.
Sure.
I wondered if sort of thinking about the book and thinking about your talk, if you've thought about sort of, you know, Fernand Brauddel's Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II has this sort of, you know, tritium of echelons. You have sort of the longue durée of history. Mm-hmm. You have the structures and disjunctures, and then you have sort of, as he calls it, the crest of the waves, which is the events of people. And yet, of course, you take sort of the opposite angle, looking at the events of the people as sort of your main part. And I wonder if you thought that perhaps now is an interesting time to sort of question that vision of history that he puts forth in with the Annales School as sort of social and environmental history in many ways at the beginning, and say, no, in fact, we can look at a history that is environmental and is social that looks entirely at the level of individual human stories, and perhaps those individual human stories being sort of the main foci, become a better access point out of which to make, not just a political argument, but an argument that is aware of the longue durée, aware of the structures and disjunctures at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ways that I wanted to talk about the science in the book was to tell the story of Charlie Veron, nicknamed Charlie after Darwin, who's our great coral scientist, and an extraordinary man, and an extraordinary story. Quite sad story, really, because his daughter drowned, and he had, it was I think the death of his daughter made him think a great deal about the death of the reef for the first time. He was a joyous celebrator of the reef, as a diver. And what I tried to do was to tell Charlie's story in a way that gives you the science, without it being too preachy. I'm certainly being preachy tonight. But I assume that, I'm going to meet a group of people who are already simpatico. But I really do think there is a problem of the complexity and specialisation of all of our learning. And science is not only the problem there, but certainly it's very, very considerable. So somehow we've got to put it back together. We've got to join up. And so part of my message is we really do need to work with art, science, humanities, social sciences together. But the other thing is, I do believe stories are one way to grab people. There is a sense in which if you can find one of those stories in my book with which you identify, you're getting closer to becoming an environmentalist if you weren't before, or sympathetic to it. And I have had people who are hostile in audiences, especially when I was talking up in Queensland, who've subsequently written and said, actually, after I read such and such a story, I've changed my mind. I mean, not huge numbers of them, but at least some, enough to give me a feeling of hope. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. I have a question about morale and optimism.
Yeah.
So I studied earth science in college, specifically biogeochemistry, and in many of my lectures I had fellow classmates in earth sciences or natural resource management, and in many of our classes we learned about climate change and other environmental issues. And sometimes we would just sit back after a lecture about, for example, learning the physical process of ocean acidification. It's so huge and so unstoppable for us humans against, the forces of chemical molecules in the entire ocean and on the entire planet, or learning about how northern ice sheets are shrinking every year, or desertification in China. There are so many things that are very interesting, but then at the end of the day you sit back and think, well, the whole world is going down in flames, and how can we, how is it possible to remain hopeful and optimistic in spite of all of this?
That's a good point. I mean, I suppose what I wanted to say, and I didn't really have time to say it, but certainly I do believe it, that there are hopeful things that happen. I mean, for example, the Mission Beach story is very hopeful because there was a deeply divided community between developers and environmentalists, between different kinds of environmentalists. Some were cassowary people, some were rainforest, and some were coral, and so on. But very much this question of development and resorts and so on. Now, the whole lot of them have been persuaded by the catastrophe of the double cyclones. And then they have completely changed the way that they operate as a community. So that, if you regarded that as a kind of germ of something, a germ of change that can occur. Admittedly, you had to have a disaster to make it happen. nevertheless, that at least is hopeful. And telling a story, the Aboriginal story, it seems to me that Lockhart River, which was a desperate place with alcoholism and absolutely a kind of lost community, that the story of Anko, even though he's a white guy, has really transformed them. I mean, I don't know if it'll last, but there is a feeling of pride and a sort of sense of knowledge of their own background, their own language, starting to learn for the first time their own language. So I do think there are these little bits of hope. And every time you meet people and talk to them and they are concerned about the reef, and it's not just the reef, I just happen to be talking about it, but you know, there are many other issues, and I'm sure Kansas has issues to face, environmental issues to face. It certainly has some very good environmental people in the university. So again, these people are nodes of hope. But I do agree with the point that you made. We can paralyze our audiences by being too despairing. We can paralyze them, just make them think, well, what can we do? I mean, it does seem so massive. And it is hard to. So one of the things we do in our centre is have a kind of volunteer movement of students and others who come and we work on, we do small environmental things around the community. Simply to illustrate, these aren't earth-shattering changes, but they are positive things that you can do. They're a small thing, beginning with your own backyard.
Emily?
Hi.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with the space that you're in right now, but the Commons is a site on this campus devoted to the very thing that you're talking about with this nexus of arts, sciences, and humanities. So I wonder if you could maybe shed some light on an experience that you've had to sort of observe how that relationship most effectively goes, or how it starts.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, I owe my whole kind of shift in career from writing very academic work to trying to write public work to a scientist. We work together on a it's an area, actually it's a plateau the size of Belgium, actually, in Arnhem Land in the north that had been abandoned by Aboriginal people in the 1950s. And because we're no longer managing the environment, it just went absolutely toxic. So you think if humans don't participate, it's going to be a good thing. On the contrary, massive wildfire reduced the biodiversity of the plateau almost to nil because the Aborigines weren't there. So talking to this scientist, he persuaded me, he said, you know, you can tell a story, you should be telling your stories out to the public. So I have worked with scientists in every project. Though I am a humanist, there's no question about it. I don't really think like a scientist. My son, oldest son, is a scientist, and he thinks I'm a twit. Although he's quite nice about it. Yeah, look, there is a change occurring in Australia. There is no doubt about it. We're just setting up a Future Earth group in Australia, and Future Earth has been, up until now, entirely science-based, and the humanities and social sciences and the arts are in the forefront of that. Also, when we changed we have this group of national research priorities, which you're supposed to try and conform to, and one of them is environmental change. And now that meetings over that are joint meetings with humanities people and scientists for the first time. So I do think the environment, and you know, I met an ecologist from Kansas tonight, from your university, who agrees absolutely with me. I mean, we think absolutely alike in our belief that we have to work together to solve environmental problems. Doesn't mean you have to be cross-disciplinary, I mean interdisciplinary in one sense. It means you've got to work with people who have capacities and understand them and use them in a collective kind of way.
Do you think it inhibits an individual if they are if they have a lot of interdisciplinary qualities, like in a situation where a lot of people from different disciplines are together? What do you think that person's role could, maybe that's a little bit abstract.
No, we were talking about that tonight. It is actually very difficult if you're an academic, because you get judged by your specialist peers. I get judged as a historian, not as someone who uses literature or uses art or uses science. And so you actually, you do suffer from a disadvantage. And I run an interdisciplinary centre. It has every discipline in the university in that centre, and the university says it's a wonderful thing, and every dean loathes me and puts any obstacle they can find in the way. So you know, I mean, it is very difficult. But there is a climate of a sense that, after all, we do know that environmental damage is human-based to a great extent. So it's a human problem as well as a scientific one. I mean, it's a no-brainer that we've got to get together in that sense.